Welcome to the Libertarian Conservative Group podcast, the show that discusses everything from a libertarian conservative twist. I'm James, and today we're joined by Anthony. On today's show, we'll be talking about universal basic income. I have with me Anthony Sammeroff, who co-hosts the Scottish Liberty podcast and is featured prominently on other libertarian-themed shows. He is also known for his published works such as Universal Basic Income, For and Against, which is available on Amazon. How are you doing today, Anthony?
I'm great. How are you, James?
I'm doing very well. How are you coping under the lockdown?
Well, I have to say the first few weeks were fine. I just got my head down and worked. I'm still getting my head down and working, but I do miss going to my local and having a coffee while I work on my writing and seeing my friends. I'm looking forward to going out again. So yeah, it's at first it was a little bit of a novelty and I changed my schedule around, but I'll be looking forward to returning to whatever normal passes for these days. How about yourself?
Something similar, to be honest with you. I've got no work, so I've been ploughing all my time into the think tank, the Libertarian Conservative Group, and just 100% just productivity where that is. But it is becoming a bit strainful in the sense of, you can't just go out like you said. Because for me, it's not so much the socialising. I'm not really bothered about that. I normally socialise over the internet anyway. I'm a right hermit. But
Right,
it's just being able not to be able to potter around,
right.
winding me up, just mill around, I don't know, a shopping centre or a town centre, or just go out to the countryside, because where I live, you have to drive a little bit, and you're not allowed to do that, even though it's not against the law. So,
Mm.
weird times, really. Weird times.
Yeah, it has been weird. I got moved on by a cop the other night just for lying down in the grass in the park. There wasn't anyone in any close distance to me. I thought he was saving the park. I thought he was shutting the park because it was in the evening. But no, he wasn't shutting the park. It's just supposedly too late to be sunbathing. I didn't
Yeah.
ask.
One thing I've noticed is, it's funny how they found all the police now. But when there was actually crimes being committed, it was more on the lines of, we don't have the manpower to deal with it, but now they've got the manpower to tell you to get out of an empty park.
Yeah, it's funny because I always think, don't police have better things to do than stop and search people and all the sorts of weird things that they seem to get involved in that that aren't very risky. It's one of these things when you have the government running a department, they won't necessarily do what most people think they ought to be doing if
Yeah.
it's not in their own interest to do so.
No, it's shocking times, as you says, when things get back to normal, whatever that may be. So
Right.
I have to ask, what made you write your book comparing universal basic income in the for and against format?
That's an interesting question. Well, there was someone in my city, Glasgow, in Scotland, running a series of events exploring the UBI, and it was hard pushed to find anyone against it.
Yeah.
And someone put me forwards, so I prepared my little talk, and I'd already written about various sort of libertarian or free market or less government ways to improve people's living standards. I didn't want to just tear the thing down. I
No.
kind of wanted to provide an alternative, which I try and do in the book, which is a third of the book is given over to explaining how the government basically impedes living standards. So I had the plan, I had basically the makings of a talk there, and it did pretty good on YouTube. I was asked to appear on the Tom Woods show. I
Yeah.
think that was the first time I was on there. People liked the talk, and at some point I thought, well, I ought to get that talk transcribed, and maybe I'll change it into a little book. So I got a transcription made, and I kept on adding to it. I added more arguments, and I want it to be fair. So even though I'm coming at it with my own prejudice, I wanted it to seem as non-partisan as possible
Yeah.
in the sense of it's obviously partisan, but I just didn't want to give people who disagreed with me the sense that I was coming like in an oppositional way, because I mean, what's the point? Especially if you want to influence ideas. So I tried to include as many arguments in favor of the UBI as I could, um, offer the arguments against, and then present an alternative.
Yeah. Well, I've got to admit, I'm someone who was against universal basic income, not on the morality side, but just more on the logistical, the logical side of it, the financing, the economy, etc. But after reading your book, I'm not going to lie, it's put me on the fence. On one hand, I can
Really?
see I can see the humanitarian reason for it, but at the same time, I'm still skeptical about how we're going to afford it. I've been doing digging around into that, and of course, we can discuss all that in a bit. But for me, I was dead set against it. But you have swayed me into the middle by presenting the for and against arguments, because taking people out of poverty, ultimately removing the poverty trap which the current welfare system sets in, has always been a key argument for me against the existing welfare state. And people have always asked, well, what would you replace it with? And I'm like, well, that's a good point. And universal basic income could be that option. Of course, there are many problems to that, but there's also many benefits as well, which your book has clearly laid out.
Well, that's pretty funny because the book was written with the intention of maybe changing the minds of people who were for it to become more against it or more on the fence. And it looks like it's brought you from the again. It's had, and you're the second person to say that. Someone else said after reading the book that they were in favor. Quite a well-known libertarian, a British
Yeah,
guy, said that they'd read my book and come out in favor, which is counterintuitive to me. Maybe I did a better job of giving the devil his due than I realized, because I thought there was quite a lot of books in favor of UBI, and as far as I know, mine's the only like book for a popular audience that's critical of it. But
yeah.
as you said, so you said that the argument that kind of swayed you
It's
was
nothing swayed me. Instead of me being just, I'm not for it and I'm now not against it. There needs to be, I think, for me, there needs to be more studies done. Is it going to be practical? Is it not? Because your book does clearly and rightfully points out that this is going to cost. And this, for me, is one of the key reasons I'm against it. It's going to cost an absolute bomb to give everybody in the United Kingdom a basic income. And then there's also the argument of, should we be giving that money to billionaires? Should we not? Well, then it's not universal basic income if we single people out. But then it's your arguments when, because one thing I think libertarians do struggle with sometimes is the argument against poverty.
right.
Because the idea, and and when I say struggle with, it's struggle to convince other people that we have people in poverty's best interests at heart.
I
So,
think you're right there. Yeah,
because when you're
absolutely.
saying dissolve the state, all people automatically think is, what about the poor? What about the vulnerable? Now, libertarians, I can talk for myself, we do care about the poor and the infirm. We just have a different way of doing it. But then when we try and present alternative arguments to the current welfare system, it doesn't convince people, but universal basic income may do. That's the point. I think that's the bit that swayed me. Instead of me now being
Okay.
dogmatic about I'm anti it, I can see it from both sides now. So I'm almost
Right,
playing
okay.
devil's advocate with myself. I'm like, yes, it's going to cost a lot, but it'll get people out of poverty. But is it going to reduce government interference in lives? We don't know. What about employment and productivity? Will that go up or down? Because if productivity comes down, the tax revenue also comes down. So it's all swings and roundabouts. And I think that your book hits a good middle ground. It gets both. It should hopefully, if everyone read it, get the camps who are against it and the camps for it together in a middle consensus and look at the problems on both sides. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you said a lot there. So that was the thing that swayed you, was to think, well, it's pretty hard to sell people on, say, abolishing or even shrinking the welfare state, but maybe this UBI proposal is a step in the right direction. It seems to be that you came to the conclusion that it might be um, better, because some people
Yeah.
think, oh, if we had the UBI, then we'd be able to get rid of minimum wage and all these regulations and labor
Yeah,
laws and things like that. I'm very, very skeptical as to whether that's actually possible, because whenever we seem to get a program, it seems to always come up in addition to everything else. I
yeah,
don't think that those people who are strongly in favor of the minimum wage, which is probably most people, I would guess, are going to say, "Oh well, yeah, no, that's fine." That to be fair, if we're getting UBI, we don't need the minimum wage. We don't need labor laws, because everyone's got FU money and they can leave their jobs if they want. So
yeah,
they don't really need those government protections. I don't think, even if you had this idea, well, if we've got UBI, we can slash down the government bureaucracy, all the people and the extra people to figure out who is entitled to what benefits, we can fire
yeah,
them. That never happens. All those people are voters and all those people are union members. And if they try and sack those public sector workers and bureaucrats in the tax office and in um, the Department of Work and Pensions or whatever it is. I mean, they go on strike and then the government goes, okay, well, fair enough. Like what we'll do is we'll just find them other jobs.
yeah,
I'm very, very scared. Like if you could wave a magic wand and remove all those features of society and institute a basic income, it might be worth it.
yeah.
I'm sadly pessimistic as to whether those goals are actually realistic and achievable. What do I think is achievable? Well, I talked a little bit about in the book about various ways that the government intervenes in the economy to
Yeah.
bring the cost of living up. And I think if we as libertarians were better for advocating for those ideas, they might be saleable. But then you just never know. You never really know.
No. What about then if universal basic income won't work in its current form? Would we be able to implement maybe negative tax income in our current system? Do you think? Would that be a better way of providing almost a universal basic income without, of course, it having the drawbacks of because, like you said there, it's not going to work in our current state because we've got a top-heavy bureaucracy, and those people will not want to be sacked who are currently
Mhm.
working for the state. But if we had a negative income tax, sorry, would that be a way of people being able to at least claw back their money through taxation?
Well, I mean, I don't see a huge difference between the negative income tax and the UBI other than the way that it's paid out.
Yeah,
In terms of simplicity, sure, like just putting a sum of money in everyone's bank account seems um, simplest. It looks like a much lower dollar amount, or sorry, pound amount. What
yeah,
I'm
don't
used to
worry,
speaking to Americans.
it's fine.
It it used to sound. It sounds like a lower cost for the negative income tax than for the UBI because the UBI is paid to everyone, whereas the negative income tax is only paid to people who are not earning enough. So it's not even handed out to the people who just pay taxes to cancel out. The problem is, I think the bureaucracy is the problem. I think the
Yeah,
problem is there are far too many people working for the public sector, and the public sector represents too large a percentage of spending. And I just don't know how instituting the negative income tax is going to shrink the size of the state. Well, if we're talking about alternatives to the welfare state, um, that's a different story. The argument is, of course, if you're earning the negative income tax, you'll never be caught in a poverty trap where if you
no,
earn slightly more, you lose all your benefits at once. And that is an achievable aim, I think, if enough people care about it to alter things so that people are losing their benefits in a graded way rather than being thrown off a welfare cliff or caught in a poverty trap.
yeah,
That is a desirable goal. I think some people, if they work more than a certain amount, their effective tax rate, when you take into account the benefits they lose, is something in the 70%, which is definitely a massive deterrence to. to getting a job.
Yeah.
So that is something that needs to be looked at and is a worry. I'm
Well,
just, yeah, go on, please.
I was just going to say you do see that, of course. This is why single parent households are quite stricken at the moment, and it's not to be blamed on any government because the welfare state has become over bloated. But like you just said there, we've got it. I know people who I work with who can't work any more than 16 hours a week because if they
Right.
do, they're worse off. But that makes no sense because surely we know it makes sense because we know how the welfare system is
Yes,
structured, but it shouldn't make sense. As a libertarian, I want people to be able to go and work and make their own money and not be
that's it.
penalized. But it seems as soon as you're on welfare, you can't get off it easily because
Mm.
you're not allowed to work more unless you take a drop in living standards. And it's not a fair system, our current one now. And it's a big problem. This is why I'm saying I'm understanding your arguments completely against UBI. I agree. I agree with the current bureaucracy. We're not going to be able to change it. But it's how do we get those people out of poverty? Because we don't like socialism or the left, um, or at least their way of controlling. But they use poverty as a way to keep
They
people
absolutely
voting for
do.
their kind of policies. And they've built a welfare system that has kept people stuck in the same situation. And every time the elections come round, they blame them for it. Or, they blame someone else for the problems that they themselves have caused. And they keep those same voters resentful when, in theory, it's the man selling you those policies who have put you in
Yes.
that position and kept you trapped. So maybe not UBI, but what could we do to get people out of the poverty trap, do you think?
Yeah, the shocking thing with that, what you said about your friend not being able to work more than 16 hours, otherwise they'll be worse off. I had someone tell me that 14 years ago, that
Yeah.
they couldn't work more than 16 years, so 16 hours.
Yeah, I got.
And you'd think, a decade and a half is enough to fix a flagrant problem like that. I mean, my favorite solution is just to make sure that all benefits taper off. So if you earn an extra £5, you maybe lose £1 of benefits or £2 of
Yeah.
benefits. Um, uh, I know that some of them do taper off, but the tapering off isn't gradual. I remember reading some of the stuff by Christian Niemitz. He's an economist at the Institute for Economic Affairs that writes quite a lot about poverty. I think you're right about the fact that there's a vested interest in having people in poverty, and as
Yeah.
long as people don't have,
A way out.
yeah, or enough money to basically take their what they see as their basic needs and a little bit more, they're not really going to be open to libertarian ideas
No.
because they're dependent. And you could make a good argument that the state stands to gain from as many people being dependent on it as possible. That's why the public sector grows and grows. They're all allies of statism. The more university professors are dependent on, government grants to universities to make their money, the more they're incentivized to bring out the intellectual ideology in favor of statism. And the poor are just another demographic that are dependent on the state. So whenever I promote libertarian ideas, people will go, "Oh, I had just the other day yesterday. Oh, there's blood on your hands and things like
Yeah.
that because because you oppose high taxation." I mean, they literally don't see how those at the bottom of the economic ladder could get along without the government. Well, in my book, I go through, in one of the chapters, I demonstrate that house prices have gone up by at least 8 times since the beginning of the 80s, right?
Yeah.
Imagine if everyone's rent wasn't, let's not say an eighth of what it is now, even half of what it is now. How, and the, or their mortgage, right? Sorry, I should add, I demonstrated how specific government policies created this situation where house prices went through the roof. Well,
Yeah.
I find it pretty hard to imagine that we'd have poverty comparable to what we have now if everyone in the country was paying half as much for their rent or their mortgage, because there'd be so much more money sloshing about to help those at the bottom of the economic ladder. It would be cheaper to house them, funnily enough. and it also would mean that people had more disposable income lying around to spend on other things to put those people into jobs. Yeah, one thing I should say is the poverty industry doesn't really see a job as a way out of poverty. It only seems the only things they're ever advocating for are more redistribution and handouts.
Well, I've got a good Ronald Reagan quote here. Let me just get it up. Sorry, it's just as you said there. They don't view the job out of poverty, and I don't want to hash it up, but I think Ronald Reagan says the best social programs are well-paying job, and he's
It's
right.
He's true, and the thing is, people don't realize that a low-paying job was and should be a stepping stone to a high-paying job. People say, oh, the people are earning like minimum wage or less than. If there's no minimum wage, people would earn too little. But you don't actually see that without the minimum wage, there would be so many more jobs that someone could take a job, learn all the skills there is to learn in that job over 3 to 6 months, and then move to another job quite easily
Yeah,
without having to compete against everyone else. And
because you're
in
all
doing
pitted at the
so,
bottom.
yeah, and in doing so, gain more skills and and then feel competent to take a manager position or a supervisor position or even start their own job or business by learning skills on the job. People don't really see that by limiting people's access to on the job experience. They limit their ability to climb up the economic ladder in the future.
Yeah, no,
They
no.
don't
Go on.
Sorry, they
Sorry.
don't see a job as a means to skills. They just see, oh, well, that person's not getting paid enough. Yeah,
No, I get that completely. Like you say there, I'm in full agreement. I do not agree with the minimum wage at all because I know many people who are working at minimum wage are more economically valuable. But because minimum wage laws are there, they don't have to, companies are not having to pay you for your economic worth. It also removes, like you said, competition because I've gone for jobs before that I know I'm overqualified for, but because the employer is scared that I might, be aspirational, and then they
right.
can employ someone who's not aspirational, they've gone for them instead. Because I remember one of my very first jobs, believe it or not, I've been rejected from a job at McDonald's when I was
All right.
16. Yeah, I didn't even get an interview, and I didn't think that was possible. But I must have answered the aptitude quests a bit too strongly, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, that could certainly be true. It's not a foreign concept that someone would consider someone too aspirational for the job. I just don't think that people put two and two together. I mean, they understand that putting minimum prices on alcohol is a way of trying to get less alcohol sold by putting the price of it up, but they don't seem to understand that or want to realize that the minimum wage destroys jobs, therefore putting a job applicant in a worse off position
Well, just
because
go
because
on.
because they have to compete against each other for a limited number of positions rather than the more positions that would exist. And also, you don't need to take crap from a boss if there's lots of jobs around. You can just say, well, that's I'm handing in my notice. I'll get a job somewhere across the road, even if the pay is slightly less. That puts more pressures on employers to treat their staff well.
Well, that's it, isn't it? It'd put actually competition in the market. So let's say, for example, let's use supermarkets. It's always an example I love using, right? So let's say Tesco was offering you £8 an hour, right? And Morrison's was offering £9 an hour. Everyone would be applying for Morrison's and not Tesco. That would then force Tesco to have to value people more and pay them more. But what minimum wage does is allow companies to pay rock bottom and allow the state to subsidize the rest. And it's counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's very counterintuitive. I guess we may have strayed a little bit from
We have
basic
a little.
income, but I think that all of these things are um, sort of interrelated.
They are.
Because people don't, because the only thing that people can imagine is why doesn't the government take some money from people over there and give it to these people who need it more. They don't see the way that the government interferes in the economy to remove the ladder from people who are at the bottom, um,
Yeah.
to get to the top. And people just lose their imagination in that respect. They can't actually see what might exist if not for the state apparatus.
Yeah. One thing, again, I know you said we've just gone off topic, but this is what I love about free discussions like this. You do end up going off on tangents and discussing and learning more. You mentioned alcohol pricing. Now, funnily enough, I wrote an article a bit back, right? Not about alcohol pricing, but about the sugar tax, right?
Right,
And again, it's all linked back to poverty, okay?
that's it.
So, the University of Cambridge did a study on the price gap between more and less healthy foods, and the findings between a 10-year period, 2002 to 2010. Now I know it's outdated, but it is still a good benchmark. And
Mm.
it found that healthy foods were consistently more expensive. So on average, healthy food had increased £1.84 per 1,000 calories, compared to less healthy food, which only went up 73p per 1,000 calories. Now, again, we're back in the poverty trap, because what are do-gooders doing in society? Let's put a tax on that. Let's increase the price of junk food. But for someone in poverty, then they're not looking at, is it healthy or is it not? They're looking at, I need this to survive, and what is going to be cheap and stretch out longer. So I think poverty and the poverty trap itself is trapped into many different governmental policies, and they don't help at all. The government does not help anybody in poverty.
Yeah, I mean, we're banned. It's not legal for us to import fruits and vegetables and cheap produce from any country in the world. There's trade barriers. There's sometimes tariffs and things like that.
Yeah.
We could be importing cheap, healthy food from the poorest countries in the world, which would help people here gain access to cheaper goods and services. And for those abroad, it would lead to them importing our much needed pounds in exchange, which they, especially those poor countries, really need to build their own economies. So that's just ideological. People are still oh, we need to protect our British farmers, or God forbid farmers in some other EU country, that we were still limited from making imports due to restrictions of being part of that group, which may be lifted soon, or Lord knows whether it'll be lifted soon with this Corona nonsense. We'll soon find that Brexit. I don't even know what's happening there. I've not been following the news, but closely. You might know better than I do.
I'm trying not to follow it as closely. I'm not gonna lie. All this coronavirus, it's depressing. And again, we're going to go on a tangent here, but let's try not to go for too long. But it's
It's
depressing
fine.
watching the news, how much people are willingly giving up their freedom. And I'm looking at it in dismay, and and we're increasing our presence on Facebook. Believe it or not, I didn't think the Libertarian Conservative group would get this. It did gain traction this quickly, right? But we've reached like, let's have a look. I think the insights on the page say about 11,000 people this week. So
Fantastic.
it's good. It's good news. People are seeing the messages we're putting out there. But from 11,000 people, you're still getting a lot of hate back, and from conservatives who are happily willing to give up their freedom for the sense of security. But what people don't realize is, once you're giving up your freedoms, you're giving up your security, and you've got nothing.
So,
It's you're gaining nothing. All you're gaining really is the lie that you tell yourself that you're all better off for it. And I've stopped watching it, because I'm there like, this is a conservative government that is acting like the Labour government. I might as well have voted Jeremy Corbyn, because at least I wouldn't be getting socialism by a third party. And
right.
it's surprising. I don't know what you think about all this.
Well, I mean, there are people who were celebrating the consecutive victories as under the by the grounds of, when they look at the culture and hear what people are saying and things like that, it's very left, it's very social justice warrior orientated, and then the conservative win and they suddenly go, woohoo, it's not as bad as I thought. But I can't help but notice that the Conservative Party are economically to the left of where Labour were under Tony Blair.
Yep.
So they might be conservative in name, but they're basically gone about putting the new Labour manifesto into practice. So it is a worrying trend because Boris Johnson won an unprecedented majority, and what he could have done was, you know, just cut. And people would complain and go this, that, and the other. But 5 years. Well, this coronavirus thing would have gotten in the way, of course. Um, Now you're in a position where the government has to basically come out and say they're giving everyone money because they're
Yeah.
not letting people earn for themselves. They're not letting people make their own decisions on whether they want to go to work or keep their cafe open despite the threat of no one coming in to buy anything because they're afraid. They're not giving people that decision, and this is sort of coming back to the UBI thing where the people are going to go, well, the government should give everyone an income, and then after this crisis is finished, people might get quite used to getting their income, and they might think, well, this is working out okay. I just wonder who the hell's going to pay for all this stuff. I don't think we'll really know what the negative economic consequences of this lockdown are going to be for a long time yet, even after things open up. Um, it's
Yeah.
going to take a long time to measure how much less wealthy people are.
Well, I don't know if it's anything to go by, but the Bank of England, of course, predicted a 14% fall in GDP 3 days ago. That's the worst recession in 300 years. And people are saying that we need to do that. People are saying this is all necessary to save lives. While saving lives should always be paramount to people's interests, there was a better way of going about this lockdown than just a standard, lock down everybody. Because I've got no underlying health conditions. I don't know about yourself, but I could have gone to work quite easily, keeping the wheels on the economy while the people who were scared and vulnerable stay at home. And it
Yeah,
could have been a
quite right.
best of both worlds. The economy would have taken a slight hit, but it's not to the point now where we're going to be looking at millions of job losses. And guess who's going to be hit by that? The under 25s. The people who are already economically suffering from the last recession. The house prices have gone up, like you've said, government intervention has destroyed any prospect of house ownership. And now, on top of that, we're also not going to have any jobs to go back to. And it's depressing prospects.
It is depressing, and like you said, it's depressing how gullible people are. And I don't like when I was growing up, I'm a little bit older than you, like the
Yeah.
left used to consider themselves to be anti-establishment. And all I've seen since pretty much since Obama came into power is the left are like whatever the government says is good, even though they constantly go on about the how much they hate the Tories. It's like they love the EU. I can't see anything more establishment than the EU. It's like
No.
uh, I when the any any vestige or claim to being radical or anti-establishment under the left is long since gone. I mean, whatever the establishment position is, not only is it their position, but they seem not to want anyone it to be politically correct or publicly acceptable to have another position. It wasn't just that they were against Brexit, right? They wanted to make it socially unacceptable for anyone to say they were in favor of Brexit in
Yeah.
public in case they get shamed and clobbered. And that seems to be their tactic for everything. If you don't have their opinions, then you're meant to feel scared to say it in public. And I fear that's what's happening with this pandemic. Like if you're meant to be afraid to say I think the lockdown's a load of nonsense, right? I
We've
think it would
been
be
getting some flack for
yeah,
that.
I think it would
We've
be
been getting
much
some
better
flack.
for people. I think it would be much better for people if you let them make voluntary decisions about this.
Yeah, because I'm. What is life going to be like after the lockdown? And I don't like the fact that even though they say we're lifting the lockdown, these social restrictions are still going to be in place. They're still going to be telling us how we're meant to live. they want us to go back to work to earn money, but we can't choose how we spend it because they've still shut the rest of the country down. It beggars belief. I don't know. I really don't know with it. Only time can tell, as you said, I think, with how everything's going to go down. Um, Going back to universal basic income, one argument widely used against it, of course, is that it undermines incentives to participate in society. Now, no decent society should tolerate dire poverty or starvation, but for those who are able to work should, and the safety net should be there to help individuals and families get back into participating in society, help them overcome unemployment, to find work, retrain or move cities, whatever is possible to help them get back to being a functional member of society. So with UBI, would it remove that requirement or that drive to become a part of society, and would it just guarantee a lifetime of dependency, do you think?
For some people, it's certainly, if people are sort of introverted and want to keep to themselves, it certainly gives them a way to do that. I'm concerned for people who've got like video game addictions or substance addictions already. You're actually, in those cases, you're potentially making things worse for people, not better.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, I mean, it definitely would allow those who don't want to participate in society not to participate in society, as long as they're willing to live at a level that the basic income allows, which might start pretty small. I'm not sure how small, to be honest, and it might grow over time, because each party can always come along and say, if you elect us, we'll increase the UBI. I think the welfare state in general, and it's obviously not a popular opinion,
yeah,
undermines society, and it's thought to fulfill the roles of society, which
yeah,
is, it makes sure that people have enough money to get by. But the sad thing is, before the welfare state existed, there was a welfare society where people were
yeah,
members of friendly societies and mutual aid societies. And, if you got unemployed and you were the member of a labour union, the labour union would help you find a new job. They didn't just go to the government and protest and get the government to pass laws. Um, all people were incentivized to be involved and know their neighbors. People go, "Oh, we live in such an atomized society. That's capitalism for you. People don't even know their neighbors." It's the opposite is the case. The
yeah.
state has created a situation where people don't need to know their neighbors, because they go to the state for help rather than to their neighbors for help. And I think that that's a bad thing. It means people have, because the state can give you the money, but it can't give you the connection. It undermines the need for people to create institutions of mutual aid or of benefit that are funded by those who have means to help those who don't have means, and can know the details on the ground, know what skills people need, know what job opportunities are available in their local area, and also know that they're not throwing good money after bad, knowing that, when they're giving money to someone, that's to help them gain a ladder out of poverty, not to gain a dependence on that organization. And the government simply doesn't have the local knowledge on the ground to provide services at that level.
No, that's true. Like you just said that. I was arguing with someone the other day because I pointed out them. You know what Captain Tom Moore's done? Great. You know why it's great? It's great because A, he raised a lot of money, okay? B, it's also shown that if people care about something, they will actually pay for it. He raised over £30 million, and people have donated that even during these economically challenging times. Why? Because it's something they care about. What he's done inadvertently is show that actually people can be charitable, society can be charitable, and you don't need a government. And this person kept coming back, yeah, well, before the welfare state, people had no education, people were poor, we didn't have infrastructure. I was like, that all three of those points are lies. The infrastructure we've got today was built not by the government, but by philanthropy, private businesses. The workhouses weren't great. Let's not beat around the bush with that, but they did educate people. Churches educated people, charities educated people, and you've even got stories, whether they're true or not, of wealthy baronesses taking urchin children's, making them adopted children's, educating them up to be gentry, if that makes sense.
Sure.
There was the charity society, like you say, before the welfare state, and in some ways it was more effective.
In many ways, it was more effective, but I think that the thing that people who say that really miss is that the whole of society was much poorer before we have the welfare state, because there was less time to create all the wealth that we enjoy today. Um, People don't understand that if when a flat screen TV came out, it cost between 1 and 2 grand, and now you can get one for £97. You're Even if your wage is exactly the same, you're a richer person because the price of goods has come down. And that is how capitalism enriches the poor. It brings down the price of goods and services.
Yeah,
Over the time since we got the welfare state, the average standard of living, the standard of living of what we call impoverished, is high compared to what it was to the average standard of living a couple of 100 years ago. I mean, we acknowledge if someone doesn't have electricity or a refrigerator, I mean, they're very poor by our
yeah,
standards today. But it wouldn't make sense to say that someone was impoverished because they didn't have electricity 100 years ago. And just because um, someone would be fairly well to do to have a refrigerator in the 50s. Um, so yes, poverty to some degree is a relative thing. It's relative to what we recognize.
yeah,
Um, but society has far more resources available to look after the poor, and it's an assumption to assume that those voluntary institutions under the welfare society that existed before the welfare state would not have been far better now than they were back then. I mean, your TV's got better, your laptop gets better every year, or your smartphone. The technology we use in medicine has been revolutionized over that period.
yeah,
Anywhere you look, we've seen institutions improving. Um, excuse me, to the degree they're in the private sector. Um, that it's really impossible to gauge what kind of third sector would exist to help people of low means today if it weren't for the government taking on that role. And then everyone just assumes, well, it's the government's job. So they lose their imagination and they lose their desire to fund these
yeah.
voluntary institutions that might exist.
No, that's true. Um, just going back to where we started before about, participation in society, you did make a really good point, and that was social cohesion. So, individuals gain not only income but meaning, status, skills, networks, and friendship through work. Delinking work with income while rewarding people for staying at home is what lies behind social decay, crime, drugs, broken families, and other socially destructive outcomes. These are more likely to take place with high unemployment, as is evident in the drug pandemic in the US. So that's again another thing against universal basic income. It would almost reward people for not engaging in society, I think.
That is one thing that is worth being wary of. I'm not really sure how we put the genie back in the bottle in terms of improving social cohesion now. Um, I guess it's just we're just gonna have to watch the show and see what kind of direction society swings in.
Yeah, that's very true. One final point, I think, and it's a very good one to make, and I think we'll end the podcast here. Is money a birthright? Capitalist countries are built on the ideological foundation that money is something we earn. Universal basic income would completely change this. Some believe that community service should be a requirement for receiving universal basic income if it was to be implemented. Do you think that'd be the right way to go around it? To
It's
stop, of course, the social decay.
it's kind of hard to say because see, as soon as you're saying, well, the government will give you the UBI in exchange for community service, what you're basically doing is you're replacing the market economy with socialism through the back door.
Yeah.
All right now the government's deciding what jobs people do for money. I don't know where I'd stand on it. It depends what counts as community service. Um, uh, then there's the other argument that some people would make. I don't know if it's valid or not. Oh well, then you're just going to be putting people out of a job because the government's paying them to do those community service things, whereas they might get a private
Yeah.
sector position doing that job. These are things to weigh up. I like the idea of there being impediments to everyone and anyone being able to take advantage of this money. So from the other angle, I can definitely see the argument in favor of it. Um, Sort of conservative-minded people like the idea of using the government to um, increase social cohesion, or the same way that the left want to influence the culture when they get in power. The right think if they get in power, they'll be able to influence the culture the way that they want. I think that I think they're overly optimistic in the
Yeah.
government's ability to do that, especially when you consider that it's against the aims that if you look at government, it's like the government of the gaps, right? Whatever is dysfunctional in society,
Yeah.
people think the government should fulfill a role. Therefore, governments are not really incentivized to remove dysfunction from society. So long as there's dysfunction, there will be government. And I'm not saying that people in government deliberately go around trying to screw something up, but you know, things tend to go in the direction that the economic incentives push them in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, whether you like it or not, um, if they put a tax on cigarettes, less people are going to smoke, or people who smoke are going to smoke less because the price of cigarettes is higher. Um, and similarly, if if you have an institution which is incentivized to create dysfunction, not to solve dysfunction,
Yeah.
then that is going to tend to be the result of having that institution, I'm afraid.
No, that's right. And as Ronald Reagan would have put it, no government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. Government programs, once launched, never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to internal life we'll ever see on this earth. And I think
Right.
that epitomizes the point around universal basic income. And it's why, like I said at the start, I'm not for it, but I'm not against it anymore. And what I mean by that is, I'm against the bureaucracy that it will bring. I am against the amount it will cost. I'm against the social cohesion and the destruction it will do to that. But I am for its way of removing the poverty trap. I am for it enabling people to make something of themselves without having to worry about surviving. But the problem ultimately comes down to universal basic income on both sides is how do you fix both problems? If that makes sense. How do you fix, on one hand, the against arguments and on the other, the for arguments to make it structurally workable in this country?
Well, I dare say we'll be hearing more about it in the future.
Yeah,
If anyone's interested in the book Universal Basic Income For and Against, I definitely recommend it. You can get a copy on Amazon.
yeah, I
If
will
you,
link it in the description as well.
if anyone listening wants their copy signed with a wee note, they can message me on Facebook and I'll send them one down from Glasgow. Um,
I've got one right here. It is nicely signed. Thank you very much.
Right, yeah, yeah, and I'd encourage people to get in touch and say hello and things like that because it's nice to hear what other people in the movement are up to and what they're thinking about.
Yeah, and I think that is a good point to end it on. So it's been a great discussion, Anthony. I'd like to thank you for coming on today. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, a great pleasure. I appreciate the invitation.
No problem at all. I would also like to say thanks to everyone who's been listening to the Libertarian Conservative podcast. Before we go, I'd appreciate that if our listeners have enjoyed our podcast to hit like, press subscribe, and until next time, goodbye.